Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here today to review Sugar Mountain. I think I had reviewed this movie quite a while ago, and I just decided, you know what, it seemed that bizarrely, I think people were interested in it. Probably the people that are interested in just Sugar Mountain, because I guess that was an actual location, and I didn't realize that till just now. I thought it was just a bizarre title of a movie, but I guess it was just a location spot where realistically this movie may or may not have been filmed at. So so going to this movie, I thought that this movie was actually pretty interesting. It kind of feels like a very vastly different movie than I'm used to seeing, which is either horror or like an action film or a superhero movie. And I think that's the main reason why I wanted to get back into this film and re-review it as quickly as possible. Just because I liked how this movie did stand out, and how it really seemed like a movie about hikers and people that go on and mountain climb and stuff like that. That really intrigued me, and going into the old fashioned way of things, of just survival of the fittest and trying to survive in the elements, is kind of an interesting movie to me. So going into this film, this entire movie is basically about three people, and one guy who is consistent at wanting to try to pull off some kind of hoax, trying to pull off wanting to go out in the mountains somewhere to hide away somewhere while everyone is going out to look for this person. And then eventually, after a certain number of days, this guy is going to come out of his hole to eventually say, "Hey guys, I'm alive and I'm perfectly fine." And to just put on this elaborate hoax so this guy can put together a book and try to sell his story after all of this. I thought it was actually really intriguing, and the more that this detective just won't let things go, and the more that this detective starts to kind of unravel everyone's story, I think the more interesting that this movie becomes. Plus, also, you have consistently Jason Momoa's character is a much more of a villainish character in this movie, who's Joe Bright, where we can kind of understand exactly where he's coming from, but then also this guy just kind of manhandles and pushes people around when he doesn't get exactly what he wants. But then again, you can understand why. That this guy had lost out a portion of money, and he's coming to these people to fulfill that amount of money that he should have rightly been getting, but these people do not have. And eventually, the more and more, there's a lot of twists and turns that go into this film. There's a lot of actual surprising things that eventually go into this movie, and I thought were just man, so wait a minute. So there really is something here, or wait a minute, they do just come up with this kind of story or hash it out or whatever, and it just comes into a string of lies for a number of people in this film. I thought that this movie was really interesting, but at the end of the day, I could say go out of your way to finally see this film. Evidently, it is still on the app Tubi, Tubi. It's a free movie and TV service. At the end of the day, you could say you've seen any number of movies for absolutely free. Considering it's still on Tubi, I would still recommend you check that out there. There is absolutely no fees. If anything, all you need to do is just sign up, and there you go. Uh, Plus, also you can see a number of also other retro movies that have also been on Tubi as well. I think Double Dragon has been on there for a pretty decent amount of time. I think still, so you can probably check out Double Dragon if that's what you want to do. But anyways, so this movie is basically about one man's survival that is to eventually like turn into this escalation of like suspense for a number of all these characters. And like it kind of comes into a survival movie. It kind of comes into people going out and searching for this one man. Like to me, it kind of reminds me of that one film called Invincible, where the guy is to be put into a sewer, and the spirit of the guy like astro projects out of his body to haunt this one girl who was a part of this whole thing. And he tries to like Jiminy Cricket her into getting his body to be out in the public so he can survive, or he could like live again. And so like this, like in a small way, reminds me of that. um but if anything, there's no Jiminy Cricket like moment. This guy isn't going to astro project his way into trying to get the people to find him. No, like if anything, this guy is just going to be having his story, and the people trying to find him are living theirs, and eventually, like the two will eventually get connected at some point in this movie. So if I was building this up to be like much more an extravagant movie than it actually is, like the ghost of this guy is coming after these people. No, that's not at all what's happening. Like I'm just saying, it's a similar kind of film with basically these people eventually being motivated to try to find this guy. So let's go into spoilers about this movie. And I think it's about that time to say that it is spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time I'm going to spoil this movie. So it seems both Miles and Liam are to have had a mother with a boat. It seems that her mother had died, and that's where Jason Momoa's money is to come in, because it seems that when Miles and Liam's mother died, I guess they probably instead of paying Joe Bright the money that he was owed, I think they spent it instead on their mother's funeral and all of their needs, because they were slowly but surely also running out of money. Plus, we eventually find out somewhere in this movie that Miles like had started to like having a gambling addiction and started losing a ton of money, much more so than we were ever actually aware of. Like it's kind of funny the twists and turns of this film that eventually escalate into a much more fascinating movie. So Miles is to consistently go on and on and on about every single person that had lost a finger or a hand or something in their life, and had gotten insurance money for it. And Miles is mentioning about the guy who had went on to have the James Franco movie be about him. I think that movie is like 127 Days, where the guy ends up getting his hand like locked into the rock in the cave, and then like James Franco is just stuck there for a number of days with nobody actually knowing where he is, because if anything, like he told everybody that he was on some other part of a mountain. He's like, yeah, that's smart, real smart. So uh, so Miles is going on about a pianist that was to lose his fingers, and that like they paid out a hefty amount for that guy losing his fingers. It's like, well, I'm sure he had like insurance money specifically put out for his fingers, and that's why that probably paid out really well, because that guy like knew eventually something was going to happen with probably his fingers, so he did an insurance thing on it. So Miles is just going on and on about insurance monies and stories about that. And so Liam is like, yeah, great, we've heard it. Like, Miles keeps repetitiously bringing this up to the point to where eventually both Miles, Liam, and Lauren are on their mom's boat, and Miles makes the consensus that they like somebody needs to like one of these brothers needs to go out in the mountains and get lost and like wait out there for a certain number of days so that way they can either get some kind of insurance money for that or to sell the story of that. And so really, at first, Miles is saying that Liam should do it, but Liam knows the mountains far too well that, like, Liam won't get lost, or wouldn't be justified that Liam would get lost. So Miles has to forcibly do it. So, so Miles takes Liam to the mountains to show exactly where there is this little hole that would be this like little place for like them to like have a little home for a certain amount of time, that eventually this guy could hide out in this little hole and no one would know any better. So the game plan is that this guy is to make it to this spot, hide out for a number of days, and have people go looking for him, and then eventually show up like supposedly 8 days later. The more and more we start poking and pulling the thread of this story, eventually certain things are really starting to unravel. Like we have, like really and truly, the detective who is Jim Huxley, is really starting to kind of mention some things that were said somewhere, or like start to just kind of eventually find certain little gadgets or little things that kind of point to the fact that these people are possibly lying. But we'll get to that. So going on here, so we have Lauren, Miles, and Liam going to a bar, and so Miles is telling Liam that they need to have some fight together, and I guess they are to fight over Lauren. But before that, we have Liam who is going out in the town, and it seems that there is some girl who is to be, I think this is Angie, who is to be this woman who is to want to go out to Paris, and but eventually it seems that more and more this girl eventually is not having real true interest about going to Paris because she wants to stay here with Liam because she actually likes him. So while Liam is to go to this spot, eventually the sheriff is to come to Liam and mention like, hey, you know what? Like since you guys are looking for work, it's like if anything, I would love for you, Liam, to. This is Jim talking. Liam mentions that he is kind of interested in having Liam be a police officer, maybe a deputy or something. And Liam is like, well, yeah, like that could be something interesting to do. Like, also, me and both Miles was looking for work. And Jim kind of laughs at that and he's like, dude, I have no interest in Miles becoming any part of this department. Like, if anything, I'm interested in you, but Miles, no. So, so that kind of tells you where Miles bizarrely is uh, because that tells you where the sheriff or Jim is, because funny enough, Miles is actually dating Jim's daughter, which is Lauren, and Lauren is to eventually go over to her actual mother and father's home, and Tracy is to consistently give Lauren money for something, and Jim is to kind of appear when Lauren and Tracy are talking, and he's like, well, how much money did you give her this time? Like, it's either you live over there or you live here, because like it's not like a two-way street. And so Lauren just came in there to do laundry, and then she just is gonna come back to Miles's home. So Miles is also talking to Liam about basically he doesn't know where exactly his relationship with Lauren is going. It seems like Lauren is getting a little clingy, and that Lauren really is to the point now where I think she just wants a baby, and Miles is not sure whether or not he wants to do that with her. So, but Miles and Lauren are like consistently going at it, and Lauren is having to hear that, and so Miles is just, and Lauren is just kind of like God, like I have to put up with this every single day. Like this is ridiculous. Like for a girl that Miles is just gonna throw away. Like if anything, like he should have broken up with her before this whole thing was to happen, because what's gonna happen if like after this whole story is done with and this girl goes squeals to her father about what it all went down because she had broken up with Miles. Like she could have immediately done that after this whole thing was done. So Miles and Liam are to be at this bar, and eventually they are to have an argument that Miles is telling them that they eventually have to be putting this whole thing together. So Liam and Lauren are to go off to the side and eventually just kind of like hug one another. And immediately that is to start off this fake fight that uh, Liam are to have. So they're really fighting it out in this bar. Miles tosses Liam onto a pool table, and eventually they have this fight out. They have to be separated, and so eventually Lauren is to have this story of before where Lauren took Liam's diary, and there had been a story there about Liam's father that wanted to have Jim the sheriff arrest Liam's father. So really Lauren is playing to that same story again, that before Miles leaves, Lauren is putting a thing in Liam's book about how he wants some girl and he wants her badly. But that doesn't exactly mean that it could be Lauren. It doesn't actually say Lauren specifically. And also it says that Liam is going to do something about it, which that doesn't mean much of anything either. Like, because Liam eventually, once Jim eventually gets this diary and gets this entry, he eventually goes, what does all of this mean? And so Liam kind of skirts it away. So, so both Miles and Liam are to go out to the mountains, and so now they have to perform this punching of one another, so that way there are scars in both of them to showcase that they were again in another fight. So, so Liam is to punch Miles in the eye to, I guess, give him a kind of black eye, but it kind of hits most of his eyebrow. And so Miles goes and tries to hit Liam in the nose, but like he couldn't hit it perfectly at first, so he's like, "Oh crap, I'm sorry." So then Miles goes and hits Liam straight in the nose, where all of a sudden his nose is bleeding, as if to make it look like he maybe broke it or something. And so Miles and Liam are hugging it out, and Miles is mentioning that he'll make this up to him. So Miles goes off into the mountains, and Liam kind of waits there for a while and then decides to go off. So eventually, Liam is to file this report that his brother had run off into the mountains, and he doesn't know where he went. Both of them had been fighting about Lauren, and that eventually that is to lead to them getting in a fight. And so Miles is somewhere on the mountain, and he's not sure where. And so eventually there are people that are going out of their way to try to find Miles. People are looking for him in the mountain. And we consistently have the sheriff, who's Jim, who is kind of asking more questions to Liam about this whole entire story and how it really actually broke down. Meanwhile, we consistently have Joe Bright that is consistently asking for his money, whether it's from Miles, who of course he does not have it, or eventually Joe is eventually trying to want to get his money from Liam and beating the crap out of him in prison, because eventually Liam will head in there as well. But I'm getting a little quick on myself. So Liam is to eventually keep telling this story, and it seems like Jim isn't all quite buying it, to the point of like Jim kind of assessing or assuming that maybe Liam killed Miles on this mountain, and because eventually Lauren is to give Jim Liam's diary to try to avoid getting more people on the mountain to search for Miles. And so eventually we start to have a cutscenes where Miles is kind of making into this spot that doesn't seem where he's supposed to be. And then eventually towards the end of this movie we have a whole review of what had happened with Miles, and how eventually he like broke his arm and any number of things. So Liam eventually is to go on and eventually get arrested for suspicion of his brother's murder, because Lauren is to give Jim his diary, and it's to mention how he wants what easily Jim is to proceed is Lauren, and that eventually he's going to do something about it. And Jim asked Liam, it's like, well, what does that mean, do something about it? And Liam is like, well, I was thinking about moving out. Like, I was thinking that I think it's time for me to just move out. Like, I'm just tired of I'm just tired of living with Miles. Like, it's just... So, like, Jim is kind of like, maybe that means you are going to kill your brother, and so I am just going to have you go into prison and be held for suspicion of murder. So that's when Liam is to eventually have Joe also purposely get drunk and disorderly, go into prison and beat the living crap out of Liam, to where Liam is forced to tell Joe, because he's fearing for his life in this prison. Liam is telling Joe that this whole thing is a hoax, and eventually Joe will get his money after this whole thing is over. And Joe is like, okay, like, alright, but if I don't get my money, like, I'm coming after you. And so after that whole situation, Joe is to tell us that Joe used to work on the boat with Liam and Miles' mother, and that used to be the most fun time of his life. That, like, really, like, the guy that he has turned out to be now is probably just from the fact that, like, he's just kind of just a like a guy with no real life or no real job or no real nothing. After that job was done, like, nobody wants to hire him anywhere. Nobody wants to, like, nobody wants to have this take a chance on this guy, so that's why I guess Joe is desperate for money. So eventually we have Liam, who is in prison for quite a while, and all of a sudden they are in, like, we're at like day 8 of this, and Miles is still not actually where he's supposed to be, and all of a sudden Liam is actually starting to get worried, because it's like, yeah, like, he probably should not have been out for this long. And so also, uh, eventually Liam is to go free because there isn't any real hard evidence to have, like, Liam be accused of murder. So Liam is to eventually go and eventually talk to Lauren, because eventually Lauren, while this whole thing is to go on, Lauren's mother is to go out and search for Miles, and eventually she is to get injured along the way. She is to break her collarbone and I think get some other kind of injury out of this, to where it seems like her mother is going to die. But it doesn't really seem like that was 100% clear. Like, we could say that Lauren mentions that she's probably going to lose 2 people out of this whole situation, but, like, it didn't really seem clear that they had a funeral for her mother at any point in this movie, unless I missed that somewhere where they referenced that. But anyways, so Liam is to kind of get concerned about where his brother is, but it seems that also, like, Jim kind of makes the consensus that Liam isn't really heartbroken about this whole situation, because eventually the girl that was going to France eventually comes to Liam and mentioned to him that she has no interest in going to France because she wants to stay with Liam because she actually likes him. And Liam actually likes this girl as well. So all of a sudden they are to be in the throes of passion in this guy's car, and the sheriff is to be knocking on this guy's door to reconfirm some kind of questions that he has. And then Jim is to mention, well, I guess Liam isn't all that heartbroken about his brother going missing after all, because I guess that lends him into the arms of another woman. But while this is to go on further, eventually Liam is to be tossed in the arms of yet another woman while this whole thing is to be going on. So Liam is to eventually be with Lauren, and Lauren is to mention that she is to be doing an interview soon. And Liam is to eventually kind of help Lauren pick and choose what clothes she's going to wear for this interview. And, like, he's mentioning how some clothes bring out her eyes or something like that. So eventually Lauren is to eventually pick a thing of clothes. And so eventually Lauren is to mention how grateful she is to Liam for doing all this. And eventually Liam is to mention, like, well, like, pulling the whole Loki line of the Dark World, like, Liam didn't do it for Miles, he did it for Lauren. And eventually, all of a sudden, Liam is to start to hug on to Lauren, and then all of a sudden it is to lead to them making out. And then Liam is kind of like kind of pushing himself away, because he's like, God, like, what are you doing to me? Like why are you trying to, like, make me do this and be in, like, much more trouble than we probably should be? But eventually that is to lead both Liam and Lauren to eventually get into the passions of lovemaking, to the point of them being in a bed together, going off. And so eventually Miles or eventually Miles is to be found. Jim is to go to Liam's home and let Liam know that, hey, like, your brother was found. Unfortunately, like, Jim just keeps like butting in all the time everywhere, but I guess since he's the sheriff, I guess he doesn't care. So Jim is to tell Liam that, hey, like, we found your brother, and Jim is to see both Liam uh and Lauren in one bed together, and Jim is like, God dang it, like, God, like, you guys are just like creating all kinds of problems. Like, plus also, like, Jim thinks that every bit of all this is very suspicious, and like, all these stories are something that he can't really and truly believe. So Jim is to go on, and when Miles is coherent enough, Jim is to immediately ask Miles, is like, dude, I know this whole thing is a hoax. Like, you can confess it now. I know it's a hoax. Go ahead and spill the beans. And so Miles is kind of shivering and kind of mentioning, um, like, some stuff here and there that isn't connected with what Miles is saying. And so, uh, eventually, when both Liam and Lauren eventually make it there, eventually Miles starts talking about what had happened. But evidently, Liam kept looking for his GoPro to, I guess, like, kind of use it for something. But Lauren eventually tells Liam uh, that Lauren gave Miles the GoPro uh, for him going out there, so eventually he can record all this, so maybe he can like remember it and document it for a story or whatever. So I guess maybe that can help him eventually when he has to interview for all these stories eventually later on, to eventually like remember all of it, or eventually have both Liam and Lauren kind of understand what was going through Miles's mind during this whole time. So, so when Liam and Lauren are to get to Miles, Miles is to mention how he lost his map, on how he just got disoriented and just kind of confused, and eventually that led him to go into the wrong direction of where he was actually supposed to go. Plus, also, both Liam and Lauren eventually go and get the GoPro and eventually see what all had happened, showcasing that Miles had at some point tripped and fell a pretty good spot and eventually broke his arm, and eventually just like the longer that he went on here, eventually like he just got more and more just confused of where he was actually supposed to be. Plus he lost his map, plus he lost all kind of direction, and so like Miles was just kind of figuring out how the heck he's going to just be able to get the heck out of there. Um, Plus, at some point, both Liam and Lauren were going to the spot that supposedly Miles was supposed to be at. And so Jim followed them to that location and had uh, like, they basically switched where the search parties were supposed to go to where Lauren and Liam were going, so that way they could probably find Miles a lot quicker, uh, because Jim thought it was suspicious that it's like, dude, we couldn't have found this guy yet. Like, if anything, like, maybe he's just in the wrong part of the mountains, which he technically was, where they were searching for. So, but eventually Miles is found, and so the next thing for Miles to do is tell his story. It seems like they've gotten a number of messages from a number of different spots wanting the story of Miles and wanting to pay a pretty good penny. Like, they have a number of messages that are on their answering machine that are to be related to this, like the fees and stuff like that for this story. So eventually when Miles is to come home, because he is to come home early, because when Jim is talking to Miles, uh, Miles wants to ask for Lauren's hand in marriage because Miles wants to do the right thing now and he wants to propose to Lauren. And Jim is like, well, like, if anything, you actually need to, like, confirm that that's even what Lauren actually wants. So that's when Miles is to go back to his home early because like he wants to like see what the heck for his own eyes is what's really going on here. So so both Lauren and Liam are to consistently tell Miles that he needs to sell this story, and Miles is like, no, that's not the right thing to do. If anything, like, our mother had came to us in spirit and told me that uh, I cannot tell this story. It's not the right thing to do. And that if I were to not sell this story, that I would make it out of this spot alive. And so the more and more, like, Lauren and Liam are just like, dude, I want him to tell this story. Like, we need the money. And him not telling this story is just going to just, like, we might as well just sign our own death sentences because eventually Joe Bright is going to come for them and kill them all off, or something is going to happen where they actually do need this money, and now they're without it. And like what people are asking is a good chunk of change, and like that's what a lot of these people were probably waiting on, is this big chunk of change from this story. So eventually Miles is apologizing to Liam and saying like, you know what, like, I'm sorry that like I'm not like going right away and telling you this story, like I'll make it up for you. It's like, and Liam is coming from the place of like, dude, so we're going to do all this to get absolutely nothing out of it. Like, if anything, like, tell your story and make the money off of it and be done with all this. And Miles is like, I'm sorry, but I just can't do that. So push comes to shove. I'm gonna have to see how long this battery is for this tablet. Okay, good. We have plenty of enough time. So, because I was thinking of like, do I have a lot of like charge on this, because I don't want to lose this whole video of me doing this whole story. So, Miles goes on to eventually be pushed into telling this story, because eventually Joe Bright pops up in this situation and is now saying like, hey, where's my money? Get me my money. Like, I want this now. And so Joe Bright is telling Miles that he needs to like make the call to tell this story. And Miles is like, no, buddy, like, if anything, you need to see what you're doing, and you need to like we have this Miles almost having like a come to Jesus kind of moment, trying to like sway Joe Bright that he's doing he's doing wrong, that he needs to see the light. And Joe is like, dude, like, I don't need to see no light. Like, I want my money, and that, like, that's all that I want. Like, I don't want no light. Like, I want the money. And so we have what we see here is Joe Bright going and putting a knife to Liam's throat, and Miles still will not tell this story. Like, he's still like, no, like, I think I'm going to do right by not telling this story. And so Lauren is to eventually showcase that she has the phone in hand, and she has the papers of who had all called before to eventually tell this story. And while Joe's back is turned to look at Lauren, Miles takes a shovel and hits Joe with it, and Joe goes down, and Lauren is to say that Joe is dead. So Liam is to say to Miles, is like, dude, there was even a knife to my throat and you wouldn't tell this story? And Miles is like, well, yeah, like it was the right thing to do to go and attack this guy and take him down. And Liam tells Miles that, yeah, like, you know what? I told him to come here. I told him to persuade you to make this story. I persuaded him to come here to talk to you to make you tell this story, and you didn't. You still didn't after I orchestrated Joe Bright to come here. And I'm like, man, twists and turns. So Lauren, Miles, and Liam are to go and drive into town with Joe, or just drive anywhere to eventually, I guess, hide Joe's body. And the sheriff is to chase after them and to put the sirens on. Woo woo! Like, hey, like, pull over. So they don't, but eventually they do. And so the sheriff is to eventually, because the sheriff was to mention to Miles that supposedly Miles had told Liam that Liam needed to record some hockey game for Miles, and that's what kind of gave it away that Miles is probably going to be away for 8 days, suspiciously. But also, we have also Jim that makes the realization that that Liam had a thing on him that was to have a locator on him. It was some kind of like a piece of something that was to show exactly the location of Liam during that whole entire time. And he sat and waited at some spot for quite a while, showcasing that this guy didn't search for his brother at all, showcasing that there was something suspicious here. But all of a sudden, we are to have Joe Bright wake up from his supposed death and all of a sudden hit the sheriff and kill the sheriff, I guess, because he's dead, because they body bagged him away. And all of a sudden, one of the people are to grab a gun and shoot Joe, and now Joe and Jim are dead. And so now Lauren has to come up with this story to say that that Joe was extorting money from them, and the sheriff had come in to try to save them to perform this arrest on Joe, and that's where they were both to die. And so Lauren is like, we're going to make up that story, and that's going to be the story that we sell to people. So they do that story, they tell this lie, and everyone buys it. And so Miles is finally at the very end of this telling Liam, like, you know, I'll just do whatever you want. Like, I just don't care at this point. Like, I'll just do whatever that you want to do and whatever, like, to just get this done and over with. And so, really, that's just the way that this movie just ends, with them, I'm assessing, eventually telling this story and eventually going on the route of... Because it was kind of interesting how Liam was even trying to get some of these reporters to tell Liam's side of this story, and none of the reporters were interested in that. They're like, no, like, that's not where we're going with here. But anyways, so... yeah, like, that's a bulk of this movie, and I'm gonna get the bulk out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Goodbye, everybody.